If you remember where we left off, it had to do with focusing mostly on what a crisis is, so we're all on the same page, the collapse in production, the laying off of people, and the ramifications as that spreads like dropping a stone in a pond, as the ripples of these sudden downturns play themselves out in the economy. But where we stopped was on looking a little bit at how this impacts the government, and then how the government's adjustments to this situation feed back on the economic crisis. And there I want to talk to you about it, partly because it's in the news every day now, and it's important for you to understand, but it's also part of every crisis, this interaction between the private economy and the government. The first thing to note, and the most important, is that when you have a sudden drop in production and a sudden laying off of people, unemployment rising, all governments lose money. It's a very crucial thing that you understand that. For example, federal government and state governments rely specifically, and to a great extent, particularly the federal government, on income taxes. That's the way they raise money. And the way the tax works is it's a percentage of your income. If you're an individual, it's your personal income. If you're a business, it's your profits. And those are taxed. And if businesses are going out of business or cutting back, and if people are losing their jobs, their income is falling, and therefore the percentage of that income that they used to pay in taxes is falling as well. So governments left and right are losing money because the incomes being earned by individuals and businesses are going down, and their tax revenues depend on it. But that's not all. The second most important resource for the government are sales taxes, or excise tax. Taxes on expenditures, they're called. They're a tax the government gets not when you earn income, but when you spend money, which is a different act. You are all taxed many times. You're taxed on your income when you earn it. Then when you turn around and spend the part of your income that isn't taxed, you get taxed again on that. Nor is that the end. Everybody is taxed multiple times. So an expenditure tax is very important. A sales tax, for example, that you pay here in New York every time you buy most of the things you buy. So that revenue, since people are buying less and conserving their money and they have less to spend, sales tax revenues are down. And finally, at the local level, the most important tax of cities and towns is the property tax, tax on land, buildings, businesses. And as the values of property go down, as they are across the United States now, the tax that you can levy will go down too. There's a lag. It doesn't happen right away. The way sales taxes and income taxes drop right away, there's a lag because properties have to be reassessed for the tax to go down. But every government level loses money. That's basically what you're reading about now when you read about Governor Patterson invoking emergency steps to try to cope with the deficit. Or some of you may have noticed a lot of attention being given to Schwarzenegger in California because they have a deficit over $40 billion. Everywhere the federal government is losing its income, the state governments are losing their income, and the local governments are. Bloomberg is in all kinds of difficulty trying to figure out what to do. Okay, so what do the federal and state governments do? Well, right away there's a difference, and that's a legal point that I made last time, but some of you asked me about it, so let me repeat it to you. The law in the United States allows the federal government to borrow money when the taxes go down and they need to keep spending on programs. They can do that. State and local governments are not allowed to do that. The reason for that is American history. It's a long history of thinking that when you allowed state and local governments to borrow money to get themselves out of trouble, they went and borrowed much too much and they got themselves into trouble. So a law was passed saying they can't do it. So the local governments can't. That's why you will see so much agony at the level of the state and the local. And you don't see that at the level of the federal. They just seem to be able to spend money like it's going out of style because they're legally free to do it. But governors can't, and mayors can't, and that's why you will read that sort of thing. So the federal government reacts to the collapse of its revenue by having to make two decisions. It either cuts back spending. Government can do that. It's getting less money in, it spends less. The trouble with that is it'll make the economic crisis worse, since the problem begins by individuals losing their jobs and being unable to spend, and businesses losing their customers and therefore being unable to spend. If the government joins them and likewise cuts back its spending, the whole thing is gone. The economy becomes a free fall. So the federal government doesn't do that. In fact, what the federal government says is, wow, if anything, as everybody else is spending less money, we have to compensate by spending more money, which is what they're doing. When you hear stimulus plan, when you watched that last week and the week before, Obama got through and was very proud in signing a bill for the federal government to spend an additional $800 billion, big number, pumping money in. Okay, let's follow the logic here. The government is now going to spend, and the idea is the extra spending by the government will helpfully keep the economy going because it offsets, it compensates for the reduced spending by individuals, by businesses who are cutting back because of the economic problem. So we ask the government to come in and compensate for the private economy's breaking down, not functioning, cutting back. The state and local governments can't do that. So in fact, what the state and local governments are doing as they cope with declining taxes, since they can't borrow, the state and local governments actually make the problem worse. It's a peculiarity of our culture and of our economy. Let's see how. Well, I'm going to take the example of California. It's the biggest state in the Union. So as they go, so goes the nation in many ways, including this one. What did Schwarzenegger and the state Senate and the state House of Representatives in California just do? They worked out a deal to cover a $41 billion deficit. That's the difference between what they would have needed to get to keep going with everything that California was doing. All the state universities, all the highways, all the harbors, all the education of the children, etc., etc. They would have needed $41 billion more than they're now getting because the economy has gone through the toilet. California's been very badly hit by the downturn in real estate. If you walk through the streets of San Diego, you will see every third house is for sale. It's much worse than anything that has happened in this part of the country, at least so far. We may see that. I even notice here on 6th Avenue, as many of you have, that the number of stores that have a for rent sign is clearly different than what it was 3 months ago or 6 months ago or a year ago. No one knows how bad it's going to get. But there it is really bad, as it is in San Francisco and LA and so forth. So they have $41 billion, too little money. They're not allowed to borrow and spend. They can't. So what did they decide to do? Two things. About half of the 41, this is very rough, half of the $41 billion is going to be handled by cutting expenditures by the state. The state is going to, if we're getting less than $41 billion less than we need to keep going, we're going to cut our expenditures by $20 billion. Well, that's an example of the state making the problem worse. That is, joining the individuals who are cutting back and the businesses who are cutting back. The government's going to cut back. It's going to lay off teachers and firefighters and wardens in the jail and whoever else they cut. And the other half, this will blow you away too, the other half of the $41 billion shortfall is going to be handled by raising taxes. So the way they will handle their $41 billion shortfall is raise $20 billion more in taxes and cut government spending, state spending of California, by $20 billion, and that together will deal with their problem. And what does it mean if they raise $20 billion more in taxes? It means people who might have had that money to spend won't, because the government is taking it from them. So the irony is that California, like every other state, is going to be cutting back its own spending and reducing the spending of the public by taxing them more to cope with the economic situation. Now, if it strikes you that that doesn't make sense, good. That's the point. Yeah.
Has there been any lobbying to change the law?
Yes. States have been trying on and off to do that. And it has been the fear, particularly of the private sector, that giving the states the authority to borrow would lead them into a level of indebtedness that is, in some sort of long-run sense, even more dangerous to the economy than this short-run problem. But that's a debate. I'm not arguing that's right or but that's a debate. Yeah.
Can there be any middle and to limit the amount states can borrow instead of saying you cannot borrow at all?
Yeah, you could make that would be a compromise. Give them some limited authority. They technically have that because states and cities can borrow, but they're not allowed to borrow for ongoing budgetary problems. They can borrow for what are called capital projects, when they make a big change in the community, build a new sewer, build a school, extend a hospital. That kind of thing, which is not a normal business income outflow, then they can borrow. And all cities and towns do that. So now, if you get a creative accountant, you can do a budget by playing games with your capital, and they all do that. But they have to watch that, they're looked at, and they're covered by that. Okay, stay with me about this. Let's go back to the federal government. It has the right, and it is doing what you would expect it to do. This is what Keynesian economics, in a sense, taught the state to do. When the economic downturn comes, you spend more, because you're the really only offset left. Individuals are cutting back, as you all know. Many of you are doing that. Businesses are cutting back. They have no choice. They have no customers. And now the state and local governments cut back. If the federal government didn't go the other direction, who would save us? So the government does. But that immediately raises a new problem. The solution of every problem is always a new problem, if you understand the dialectic, as Hegel once called it. So here's the federal government's problem. In order for all this to work, in order for the government to be able to do this, as you recall, it has to do one of two things, the federal government, to have all this money to spend. They're not going to raise taxes, because that would be self-negating, that's self-defeating. If the government raises the taxes to spend more, then it's going to cut back on the spending of all the people at taxes, which will offset its extra spending. That's pointless. So it's got to go one of two other ways. It has to borrow the money, or it has to print the money, literally print the money. It doesn't want to do the last thing because that's scary, because all that money could start looking for goods, and then we would have an inflation, and that's a whole nother can of worms. And they may end up doing that if nothing else works. But that's their last resort. That's their last resort. So the borrowing is what they're doing. That's the focus. The plan of Mr. Obama is to, that $800 billion that was just passed, the plan is to borrow all of it and pump that money into the economy. If the borrowing doesn't work, and this